We're talking about Star Trek Fandom. This is episode 16.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casto, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
In the era of the Osmond family, the Jackson 5, Bullet, and Shaft, Star Trek was pulled out of its grave and brought back to life by its fans. I'm Bob Turner.
And I'm Kelly Casto. And they did it in a way that was never done before. Star Trek fans literally shook the world in the 70s with their numbers, their devotion, and sometimes their behavior.
Yeah, sometimes they did. And we're going to talk about all those fans and stuff they did back in the 70s. But first, hey, I better tell you how to find us. You can go to Facebook and see our Facebook page. It's at facebook.com/70s Trek. And we hope you will leave us a comment or a question. Hey, were you a fan of Trek in the 70s? We'd love to hear your story.
Yeah, and you can also listen to our show on iTunes. Search 70s Trek and, leave us a rating and a review. It'll help other Star Trek fans find the show.
Kelly, I gotta ask, why is Star Trek so stinking popular? What caused fans to rally around this dead show in the 1970s? Well, when writing about the allure of Star Trek, Richard Lutz had this to say. The enduring popularity of Star Trek is due to the underlying mythology which binds fans together by virtue of their shared love of stories involving exploration, discovery, adventure, and friendship that promote an egalitarian and peace-loving society where technology and diversity are valued rather than feared and citizens work together for the greater good. Thus, he went on to say, Star Trek offers a hopeful vision of the future and a template for our lives and our society that we can aspire to. I'm sorry, just a second. Before we move forward, can I get a cheer for that? Thank you. Thank you. No, leave the shirts on in the back row. Leave the shirts on.
What is up with that guy?
I don't know.
You'll excuse me if I take a breath in the middle of my sentence. According to Andrew Kozinets of Northwest University, many Trekkies identified with Roddenberry's idealism and used their desire to bring such a future into reality as justification for the participation in and consumption of Star Trek media.
Wow, very nice. Very nice. Can we hear it again? Big quotes, huh? This is the big quote show today. Nicely done, Cal. William Shatner says this of fans: we accept the premise that Star Trek has a mythological element, and then all the stuff about going out into space and meeting new life, trying to explain it and put a human element to it. It's a hopeful vision. And all these things offer hope. Maybe that's a good reason.
Maybe. Or it could be that Star Trek just has really neat ships and fun adventures.
I think that might be the real reason.
Mostly, yeah.
But whatever the reason is, we know Star Trek resonates with its fans, and it did resonate big time in the 1970s. Whether you believed that Star Trek lives or you just grok Spock in that decade, Trek reached a cult-like status with its fans.
It did, but Star Trek fandom really started when the show was on the air in the 60s.
It really did. And it's funny, too. A lot of people were surprised to learn that the term Trekkies goes all the way back to 1967. And it was first used by Arthur Saha. He was a member of the 25th World Science Fiction Convention. He was in attendance there, an author, and he was describing these fans who had shown up wearing pointed ears and these strange uniforms. And he used that term Trekkies when he was being interviewed by TV Guide.
Wasn't it kind of a derogatory term, kind of related to groupies for, the group of girls or fans that follow rock bands?
Yeah, exactly. It was meant to be a bit derogatory. In other words, who are all these Trekkies running around here? You have to remember, for science fiction authors in the 50s and 60s, when they went to these conventions, they were the stuff. And so they just kind of looked down their nose at anything new. And, that's what was going on in the 60s with Star Trek.
Buffy, get rid of these hoodlums that are invading our space. Space, get it?
I got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Do you want to read the next one?
All right. So April 1967, Nimoy is the Grand Marshal for the Bedford Pear Blossom Festival.
Actually, it was Medford Pear Blossom Festival.
Medford.
Yeah, in Oregon.
I'm thinking Bedford,
I get it. It's getting close to Christmas.
Yes, it is. Parade, and it was in Oregon. And he dressed as Spock. So, instead of thousands mobbing him, instead thousands mobbed him, and he was rescued by the police. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he was the Grand Marshal for the parade. I think he thought, I'll just show up and wear this and maybe sign a few hundred autographs and I'll be able to go. Thousands of people mob him. I think it's these early things like this that give you a little bit of hint of what's coming in the 70s. In September 67, the first Star Trek fanzine appears, and it's called Spockanalia. For those who don't know, a fanzine was a fan publication, and it might contain news, like a newsletter, but it also had fan fiction. And Spockanalia ran for a long time throughout the 1970s. Another one was called Bag's End, which was a reference to Tolkien.
I never heard of this one.
Yeah, and it ran from 67 through 1973, but there were literally hundreds of fanzines throughout the country during the late 60s and 70s.
Yeah, so April 1968, a group of fans attempted to rip Shatner's clothes off as he left 30 Rock. Like he needed help.
Poor Shat. Hey, man, his thing during the 60s and 70s about Star Trek was, hey, look, it was just a job. I was hired to do a job. I was just there. Come on. Are you telling me Shat didn't like being chased by girls and getting his clothes ripped off? I got to think he kind of liked that a little bit.
Yeah, I think so.
I think so, too. Another indication of where Star Trek was going was in January 68, 200 Caltech students went down to the NBC studios in Burbank and began to protest when they heard rumors that Star Trek might be canceled. And they held a spontaneous rally outside of the studios. Pretty crazy.
Yeah. Was that associated with the letter writing campaign?
I'm betting that it was. Yeah, this happened after season 2 had probably been in the can or near the end of season 2. So yeah, I'm sure it probably was. I say the words spontaneous because that's the quote unquote official story. Who knows? It could have been organized.
Could have been.
Those sneaky little Roddenberryites out there.
Yeah.
Hey, and then in 1969 in March, the first convention was held. A lot of people think it's that 72 convention that we'll talk about here in a sec. But the first was actually in March 1969, and it was held at the Newark Public Library. And it was organized by a librarian who was also one of the creators of Spockanalia. It was called the Star Trek Con, and it didn't pull many big names. But it did have slideshows of Trek aliens, and they did some skits, and they had fan panels. Now, this is very interesting. They had panels to discuss the Star Trek phenomenon. which we still have at the large conventions today. We still have panels discussing all kinds of little pieces of minutia about Star Trek.
Yeah. So, and it was actually, for being just a local event, it wasn't advertised broadly, outside of the Newark area, but they had 300 people show up.
Isn't that something? And again, they get the distinction of being the first true Star Trek convention. And of course, it was around 1969 in September that reruns start to appear around the country. Star Trek is in reruns.
Yay.
So we've got that September 69, and then there's kind of a gap. It's kind of cooking under the surface as it's on in syndication. And what happens?
January 21st, 1972 was the first major Star Trek convention in New York City at the Statler Hilton Hotel. So they, the organizers, now this is organized, not and advertised, right? They expected maybe 500 people show up, but they got slammed, 3,000 people.
Wow, can you imagine that? I was reading where attendees were saying that it was packed like a rush hour on a subway train. There were so many people. And this really, really is the true first indication of how fans are starting to feel about the show and how many fans are out there.
Gene Roddenberry was there, Majel Barrett, Isaac Asimov. They also had, I don't know if you knew this, a real NASA spacesuit.
Oh, that's cool.
And they showed never before seen blooper reels.
Oh, the blooper reels. The ones that Nimoy got mad about.
Yes.
It's funny, too. TV Guide reporter asked Roddenberry at that time, gee, what do you think? Do you think Star Trek could come back? And Gene is quoted as saying, I didn't think it was possible 6 months ago, but after seeing the enthusiasm here, I'm beginning to change my mind. The number of fans obviously got to him. News reports at that from that convention started hitting the national airwaves. It became national news. And that New York convention in 72 is really credited with showing fans that, hey, you're not alone out there. You're not the only ones who like Star Trek. There's a lot of us. And it really began to cause other groups and clubs around the country to begin to form up. Clubs exploded after the 72 convention. At that time, there were about 100 fanzines already in publication, and a lot of them were shown at the convention. And Star Trek was on in over 125 markets here in the U.S. and about 70 markets overseas. So at that time, Star Trek was beginning to really grow, and the enthusiasm by the fans was really starting to show.
Well, just in 3 years, 125 markets and 70 markets overseas. That's a good ramp up.
It sure is. And then 3,000 show up for the convention.
Yeah.
Think about that. It's a dead show. It's been off network air for 3 years, and you get 3,000 people. Here's what I think was fascinating was the next year. The next year, they pull 6.
They doubled it. Yeah.
Incredible.
That same year, the animated series started too.
Right. So you want to talk about sort of priming the pump, if you will. Events can begin to take on a life of their own. And I think this idea of Star Trek fandom began to fuel itself. And the animated series, a lot of people believe, was a direct result of the 72 convention and all of the people that were there. Clearly, these guys said, wow, there's an appetite for this.
Yeah. But, as I was reading a few things about the conventions, and I'm not going to get too deep into it unless you want to here, but there's a lot. This is kind of different than a lot of other things. You'd think it's a bunch of geeky boys, but it's largely women.
Isn't that amazing? It's true. There are a ton of women that went to these 70s conventions. In fact, you and I, in preparation for this, were looking at old film, and you can find it on YouTube, of some of these New York conventions in the 70s. There are a lot of women.
It's crazy. But, I mean, it's great. And, I think that's because of all of the myth that it generated, the ideals. It wasn't just geared for, I don't think, just adolescents or young males. I think it had a nice, wide, broad, sense of getting a message out to a bigger group.
And that's the stereotype, isn't it? The stereotype is it's a bunch of geeky loner boys or teenage boys who don't have any friends and can't really relate to other people. That's the stereotype that a lot of people think the Trekkies are. Go check out some of those YouTube videos, though. There are some very attractive young women at some of these conventions, too.
Yes, and they know the mythos.
They're there. That's right. So you think 6,000's pretty good in 1973? Holy cow. Hold on to your hats. Because in 1974, that New York convention drew 15,000 people.
That's incredible.
It grew by 500%. That's amazing. That is amazing. At this time, Paramount is receiving thousands and thousands of letters every week begging, demanding that Star Trek return. Some fans are even promising, please bring it back. We'll make sure it's profitable.
Yeah, well, like by August 75, there's 250, at least 250 or more Star Trek clubs
around the country. Yep.
Yeah. And 3 rival groups organizing conventions, upwards of 25 different conventions.
Gosh.
That's incredible.
It is incredible. One of the groups that was out there was called STAR, and it was Star Trek Association for Revival. Nice acronym. And they had over 4,000 members.
Wow.
And yes, one of the publications I was reading to get ready for this was saying that there was a Star Trek club on every major college campus during the 70s. That's
at least one.
Incredible. That's incredible. But I think probably the biggest event, at least for Star Trek fans, had to be in Chicago in 75. 16,000 people attended that convention, and that's when the entire cast reunited for the first time. That had to be pretty special.
Would love to have been to that one.
Yeah, really. Can you imagine? So you were talking a minute ago, about the makeup of Star Trek fans, and, we mentioned the stereotype. There was a journalist in 1975 who went to a convention and tried to describe Trekkies, and his description is really, really, let's see, what's the word I'm looking for? Insulting? Uninformed? Short-sighted? Here's what he said. He described Trekkies as, quote, smelling of assembly line junk food, hugely consumed. The look is of people who consume it habitually and at length, overfed and undernourished, eruptive of skin and flaccid of form from the merely soft to the grotesquely obese. Is he trying to say that they're fat, smelly, and zitty? I think that's what he's trying to say.
Why didn't he just say that?
Yeah, right. It would have been a lot quicker. I wouldn't have had to read so much. He went on to say that he noted their fixation on the single subject of Star Trek. Their facial expression is nearly sultry, except when matters of Star Trek textual minutia are discussed. Then it is as vivid and keen as a Jesuit inquisitor's.
Oh, my God.
Isn't that something? For these people know more of the production details of Star Trek than Roddenberry, who created them, and are a greater authority on the essential mystery of Captain Kirk than Shatner, who fleshed it out.
Wow.
You're a bunch of geeks. You know Star Trek too much, and you need to get out of your parents' basement. That's basically what he was saying.
Wow. You think that, go back 20 years, he's talking about Elvis and the groupies that Elvis had. So Roddenberry stated, I have to limit myself to one convention in the East and one in the West each year. I'm not a performer, and frankly, those conventions scare the hell out of me. It's scary to be surrounded by 1,000 people asking questions as if the events in the series actually happened.
What did you mean in episode 57 when... those questions came up.
Oh, yeah.
They did. I mean, it's funny, too, because I'm sure for a lot of fans, they looked at Roddenberry as the creator of this incredible Star Trek universe, thinking he probably had this grand design. There was no grand design. It was cranking out scripts week after week to keep the damn show on the air.
Yep.
Oh, that's so funny. And what's really interesting about this, though, is that in the 90s, Michael J. Straczynski, he pulls out an idea, a 4-season arc on Babylon 5 that is everything that Star Trek fans in the 70s thought Gene Roddenberry was doing with Star Trek. He did have the grand design. He did have the intentions in episode 57 of doing that particular thing. Everything was by design, but it really came to pass just 20 years later.
Yeah, so in 76, things are starting to get to critical mass. In May 29th of 76, Star Trek fandom's finally recognized. So they hit Saturday Night Live and Star Trek spoof.
God, I remember this.
Yeah,
I remember being a little geeky 13-year-old watching this, this episode of Saturday Night Live, and my mouth hit the floor. I was giddy. Oh my God, they're doing Star Trek on Saturday Night Live.
Yep, I loved it. So the last voyage of the Starship Enterprise. So John Belushi, and it always cracks me up, John Belushi playing Kirk. And Chevy Chase, okay, Spock. I can see that.
Oh my God,
better than Bill Murray.
Belushi as Kirk was priceless.
Oh, he was awesome.
He had the mannerisms down. He had the voice down.
The eyebrow.
Oh my God, yeah. And I don't know if you've seen it or if you've looked at it, but in that episode they pull out the phasers. And it's the toy phasers that were being sold at the time.
That's awesome.
It is awesome. Oh man, that is so funny. And when the execs come in and they start tearing down the bridge set, and Chevy Chase is trying to do the nerve pinch.
Yes.
It's funny too because over the years since that time there have been lots and lots of Star Trek spoofs, but for me that one's the gold standard. That's the one all other Star Trek spoofs are measured to. That was the best. For me, it remains the best.
Oh, yeah. And just go watch it on YouTube if you haven't seen it. It's awesome.
It is. Don't you think the fact that these guys, all right, they were let's face it, in 1976, the not ready for primetime players were the coolest people in America. They had everybody's ear. I think I think the fact that they grabbed onto Star Trek really tells us what they thought of what was going on at the time, don't you?
Oh yeah. Yep, just everything. Anything pop culture like ended up there as a spoof or something, or a rock band that is up and coming's on there. It was just the cultural aspects of Saturday Night Live was incredible back then.
It was a cultural thermometer.
Yes.
And if it hit that certain mark and was important enough, it got mentioned or a skit was done about it on Saturday Night Live. And I think that just shows us how important Star Trek was becoming by 75 and 76. And so this is May 29th, the next month. And I think this is really significant too. Tom Snyder had a show that came on at 1 a.m. called Tomorrow. If you remember, they had the Today Show early in the morning, and Tom Snyder was on at 1 in the morning with Tomorrow. Well, that was a pretty big show at the time, and it had some pretty... it talked about some pretty big topics and had some very big thought leaders on for the 70s. Well, here we are in June 76, and he's got James Doohan, DeForest Kelley, Walter Koenig, and writer Harlan Ellison to talk about Star Trek. I mean, are you kidding? This show was canceled 7 years before, thought dead. It was broke. It was in debt. It was never going to come back. Well, I shouldn't even say never, because nobody thought it would even be talked about again. And now they're talking about it on the Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder for 90 minutes. Crazy. There's another cultural temperature.
Yes, definitely.
It tells you how important Star Trek was. And I remember one of the questions that Tom Snyder asked, hey, how come this show can't come back? What's going on with that? You know, and they talk about that. But the idea of Star Trek coming back, it's alive and well. That question is being asked a lot now in our culture at that time. Pretty amazing stuff when you think about it.
Oh, yeah. So same year, you know, couple months later, August, Starlog magazine puts out its first issue. It's a quarterly magazine at the time. And on the cover, who's on the cover? Kirk and Spock and the Enterprise in the orbit. If you remember that painting, that picture. Yes.
Starlog magazine. It's funny. I can't remember where I read it. It was begun by guys who were definitely Star Trek fans. And so they think, oh, wow, this is awesome. Look what we've got going on. Let's start this magazine. Some of the articles in there on that first issue, there was an article about the Bionic Woman, about Space 1999, about the return of King Kong. And then, of course, there were 44 pages out of the total 68 pages dedicated to Star Trek. Wow. There was an article about Shatner, an article about Nimoy. There was an article in there called Star Trek Past, Present, and Future. One of the sections near the end of the magazine was one of the first ever published Star Trek episode guides. Ah. And it had descriptions of the episodes. So that's probably one of the first times that ever appears in print. In that issue, Starlog says this about Star Trek. In the 6 years since Star Trek left the network, it has grown immeasurably in popularity. It is now syndicated on 142 American stations and is being seen in more than 50 foreign countries. And in fact, they interviewed a program director from Channel 13 in Los Angeles who said, quote, "We get more mail and phone calls on this show than any other show we've ever had on the air. When the program is on the schedule and we preempt it for a special, our switchboard gets so overloaded, we can't handle all the calls."
Love that.
I do too. Starlog ended up being one of the longest running magazines for its genre. I think it wasn't it still publishing well into the 90s, if I'm not mistaken?
Oh, yeah.
In fact, it became very important as to talk about the popularity of the science fiction genre in movies and TV that really started to take off in the late 70s and throughout the 80s and 90s. Starlog was there the whole time. And in fact, Susan Sackett was Roddenberry's assistant, and she begins to write an update for Starlog magazine. And what's the update about? Every issue, it's about what's happening with Star Trek and the production. Pretty cool.
That is. So this next bit I loved. So September 17th, 1976, NASA unveils the space shuttle Enterprise.
Gosh.
Whether you know it or not, Joe and John were instrumental in that happening by another letter writing campaign.
Yep. In fact, it was a last-minute decision to change the name of the orbiter to Enterprise. Mm-hmm. Gerald Ford, I think the name was going to be Columbia. And yeah, you're right. The massive letter writing campaign sort of swayed his opinion. And at one point, his domestic policy advisor, Jim Cannon, said that the Trekkies were one of the most dedicated constituencies in the country. Mark that word, constituency. They didn't want to piss off a voting bloc.
maybe one of the candidates should get on the Trekkie, platform.
That's right.
Everybody will watch Star Trek every day in their house.
But again, just like being on Saturday Night Live or on the Tomorrow Show, here it is, proof of how big Star Trek is in the 1970s. Are you kidding? NASA's going to name the first orbiter Enterprise?
For a show that isn't even on?
Right. Anymore? It's not on the network anymore. I keep using the word incredible because, quite frankly, I can't grab onto another word that really describes what was happening here in the middle years of the 1970s. It really, really is incredible. It has never happened before the way it happened here. The fact that NASA would name the orbiter Enterprise, and as they christen it, the theme to Star Trek is playing.
Yes.
And there is Gene Roddenberry, Leonard Nimoy, DeForest Kelley, Nichelle Nichols, George Takei, and Walter Koenig. They're all there. Okay, I'm going to say it again. That's incredible.
It's astonishing.
Thank you. Fascinating. In June 1977, and it's issue number 6 of Starlog, and I had mentioned that Susan Sackett begins to write her columns. Well, that's when the first column shows up. And it's kind of significant because in that first column, she refers to not a TV show, but a movie. And that working title of that movie is Star Trek the Motion Picture. And she says, this is a working title. Imagine that.
Well, more of a done deal.
It sounds like a big done deal, doesn't it? Well, if you have some favorite memories about your fandom in the 1970s, we would love to hear from you. You can go out to our Facebook page at facebook.com/70s Trek. Tell us your story. We'd love to talk to you about it. We may even use it here on one of our next shows.
Yes, you can find us on iTunes. Just search for 70s Trek.
And next week, we will be back with more 70s Trek fun as we look at an influence from the early 70s, a British show called UFO. See you then.
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.